Hello, everyone. Welcome to the People's Mic, 3-day unfiltered coverage covering the Democratic National Convention. We've got an amazing list of people speaking, but today I am very honored to bring on Richard Wolff, a renowned economist and professor. He is a professor at the New School in New York City. And his latest book, Understanding Capitalism, is a vital resource for anyone interested in understanding systemic change and the flaws of capitalism. And he's just been an amazing person to sort of give commentary and elucidate some difficult concepts for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Richard Wolff.
Thank you very, very much. That's a very kind introduction.
Great. So Richard, you must be really excited. I heard recently Larry Kudlow on Fox News saying that Kamala Harris was a big government socialist, a California-style socialist, and that she was left to Bernie. So if I understand this correctly, you are a real socialist. So you must be really excited about Kamala Harris, given that she is a real socialist.
Well, I have several things to say in response, and I appreciate your humor. It's what you need, as they used to say, to keep from crying. What that comment shows is the utter disconnection of people, particularly in the Republican Party in this country, from any understanding of what socialism has been in the world and what it is now. It's a level of ignorance that ought to make a person hesitate to say it out loud for fear of what people will think about a person who talks like that, right? Whether the government does something or not is itself a perfectly interesting question. But a whole history of socialism, I'm talking 200 years, shows that there are many socialists for whom, whether the government does it or not, is not the important issue. It just isn't. If you take a look at Karl Marx, for example, who is in many ways still the great thinker of the socialist tradition, he doesn't write about the government. He doesn't advocate that the government do more or less. He just doesn't. It's not an important issue. There's no book by Karl Marx about the government. There's no plan that something should be done by the government rather than something else. What are you talking about? Where did this come from? Well, the answer is there is a branch of socialism, absolutely. There is a branch that believes that what we need in the world is less private capitalism and more the state should hire people to do things rather than private entrepreneurs or employers hiring people. There are people who think that's a very important distinction. Okay, and they call themselves socialists. Okay, there's no agency that issues a license as to who can call themselves a socialist or not.
Is that really so they say things like, they're in favor of entitlement expansions and student loan forgiveness and a Green New Deal and tax increases. Is that a socialism?
No. In other words, are there people who call that socialism? Yes, people like Larry Kudlow. And they leave it at that because they don't seem to know that the bulk of the socialist thinking world has been critical of that view. Look, if you really take seriously that having more government intervention in the economy is socialism, then you would have to come to terms with the fact that every single European country has more government intervention in their capitalist economies than we do. Are they all socialist? The people running those societies would fall over laughing if you said so. No. That's not what socialism is, or if to be more accurate, it's what some super moderate socialists might say, but there are a lot of other socialists who say, no, no, no. Whether the government does, I'll give you an example. In France, if you're a new parent, the government provides you with a person who helps you for several months handle the new baby in your household. It's a government service. Just like in France, you get medical insurance from the day you're born to the day you die. Bingo. Mr. Macron, who is the president of France, doesn't think it's a socialist country. Would tell you you're nuts if you say so, but he would defend those particular policies because it would be very dangerous for him politically. I mean, he's on the way out anyway, but even for him, it would be dangerous.
But wait a minute. What's happening here? Why are they saying Kamala and Biden and Obama are socialists? What's going on?
That question is easy. In the United States, the word socialist is a kind of swear word. It's a nasty, it's a pejorative, it's a word designed to make a person say, oh, I don't want that, or oh, that's bad, or oh, that's scary, all of that kind of stuff. So it's just calling names. You know, Mr. Trump is a specialist at name calling. Now it's getting him into trouble. Mr. Kudlow hasn't got that memo yet, so he is busy calling names as if that's a solution. Look, the polls in America show, and they have for years, the majority of people believe that the gap between rich and poor is too big in this country. The majority believe student loans should be relieved. The majority believe most of the things that Mr. Kudlow doesn't. So why does Mr. Kudlow call it socialist? Because he wants people to stop being advocates of, being supportive of those changes. And this is just a bad word to call them. If you get him more excited or put a couple more drinks in him, it'll be they're communists. And if that doesn't do it, they're terrorists. And we'll keep right on going. These are just dismissive words by somebody who, to be honest, he's an economist like me. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's, by the way, an important point. And it's not meant as a personal insult. Mr. Kudlow doesn't know because it isn't taught. I went through all undergraduate, graduate. I have a PhD in economics, blah, blah, blah. No one ever taught me or required me to learn what socialism is, what the varieties of socialism have been in the world and are now. So where would Mr. Kudlow get it? He would have to be interested enough on his own to go out and learn. He hasn't done that. Maybe for good reasons, I don't know.
Well, it is actually quite hard to navigate Wikipedia. So, to be fair, he would have to go on Google. He'd have to go on Wikipedia. He'd have to look at it himself, and he'd have to look up these words. And I mean, let's give him a little credit. But you mentioned the French election, and I think that's worth talking about in the context. So I'd love to see what your thoughts are on the context of this election. We're in a big election cycle, and often people look to what's happening in the UK or what's happening in Europe or France to see as sort of a barometer for what we might see happening in the US. And as an economist, I'm interested in your thoughts of sort of also not just the party organizing, like with the New Popular Front, and you have this coalition party, in which most Americans have no idea what has happened. But I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on this election and how it may, be a barometer for what we're seeing either globally or in the U.S.?
Well, I think in different ways, the recent elections, literally, they're only a few weeks in the past, both in Great Britain and in France, are barometers and are among the most important elections in a generation. So Americans should pay attention. Let me focus on the French, but I'd be glad to talk with you about the British as well. And I should explain, my father was born in France. I have spoken French all my life since being a baby. I'm fluent in that language, and I follow the events there. And I have also taught at the University of Paris. The largest political party in the Assemblée, the major parliamentary unit of the French government, the largest single party by far now is the New Popular Front. Its leader is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Learn the name because he is a socialist, a real one. He's been one all his adult life. He has been active in a number of different political parties, including the one he now sits at the top of, which he helped to organize. He's been a fixture of French politics. The people of France know him very well, his strengths, his weaknesses. He's against capitalism and says so, and always has. And he got more votes, him and his party, than anybody else. They're the number one political. That hasn't been true in France for a long time. His party is a coming together of four smaller parties that decided to unify on the grounds that if they did, you'd get a better sense of how strong left-wing opinion is in France. So here are the four parties. The La France Insoumise, that's his own party, which means France Unbowed. That's the first and the largest of the four. Next, the French Green Party, which is a left-leaning Green Party. Number three, the French Socialist Party. And number four, the French Communist Party. Those are the four united in the New Popular Front that is now the largest single bloc in the Assembly, in the Parliament, in the Congress equivalent in France. If you, let me be a teacher for a moment. If you, my audience in this moment, didn't know that, that tells you not about you, but it tells you about the media you are surrounded with, who have kept this remarkable reality away from you.
Wait a minute. I thought that only happened in Venezuela, countries like Venezuela and Cuba.
No, it happens all over the world, and it happened in France. Let me remind you, it's a civilian government in France. That means the largest political party determining whether or not they use their nuclear weapons is a socialist communist coalition. Wow. Talk about change. Even in England, where you don't have anything like this, where you have something a little bit closer to Republican and Democrat, only there they call it Conservative and Labor Party. Even there, the last election was a complete blowout, throwing the Conservatives out of office and giving the Labor Party an enormous majority. They can pass whatever they want. They're the kind of socialist who thinks if the government does a bit more and makes life a little less harsh, well, that's socialism. Whereas a guy like Mélenchon says, no, no, no. Socialism is a whole new way of organizing an economy that makes every factory, every office, every store into a different experience in terms of the economic system. And it is not merely a question of whether the government does a bit more or the government does a bit less.
Right. So, but is it fair to say that for something to be called a socialism, really, the workers must be owning and controlling the means of production versus, for instance, a social democracy in places like Scandinavia? Like they call Bernie Sanders a socialist. He doesn't shy away from the moniker. But in truth, aren't those still capitalist countries? Aren't they really just capitalist countries with a strong social safety net?
Absolutely. And I would argue, I'm a particular kind of socialist, but I would argue that the definition is what's important here, and Americans don't have enough engagement with the socialist tradition to be aware of the competing definitions. So here's mine. Capitalism is when you organize the production and distribution of goods and services, that we all depend on, our food, our clothing, our shelter, everything. If you organize that production so that a small group of people, let's call them the employer, have all the power, make all the key decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the revenue you get from producing, that's all decided, say in a modern corporation, by the board of directors. That's 15 people. If it's a big corporation, they can have hundreds of thousands of employees who are kept away from those decisions. Many of you watching or listening, you know when you cross the threshold into your job, you're no longer the decision maker. You are told by someone above you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, where to do it, when to stop, go home, come back, all the rest. A socialism, for me, stops that. Says, no, 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 that's not democratic. I want a workplace organized, because I actually believe in democracy. I want a workplace organized democratically. One person, one vote. We all get together and decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product when we're finished. That's a democratic community. For me, that's what socialism is.
So wait, so would you take exception to someone calling Kamala Harris a socialist or Barack Obama?
Yes, I think if that's all you look, if you said to me, they're the kind of very super moderate socialist who thinks a little more by the government of regulation is social. Okay, I mean, you're free to define socialism any way you want, but I would say if you don't do that, if you just use the word socialist, then you're being either ignorant or dishonest. You should be able to say, this is one kind, the way you just did. Bernie is a moderate Scandinavian type socialist. Correct. That's what the word means for him, as it does, say, in Denmark or places like that. But there are lots of places in the world, lots of literature, lots of political organizations for whom that isn't socialism at all. It's a little bit if I said to you the following. The worst dictatorship you can pick in Latin America, I will make the point, see, that's capitalism. Okay, it's not wrong in the sense that employer-employees, what they got in that country. But it's one kind of capitalism, and you would like me to believe, and I do, that there are other kinds that aren't so bad. Socialism has its range of difference too. The only reason a person like, well, the various people who use the word wrongly do it is because they live in a society which doesn't teach that to people, doesn't want them to know about the differences, doesn't want them to debate them, doesn't want to see how they work in one country or another. Let me give you an example. Around Bologna in Italy, one of the richest and most successful parts, Emilia-Romagna in Italy, 40% of their economy is worker co-ops. That is factories, offices, and stores organized democratically, where every decision is made democratically. They don't have boss over workers. They've been doing that for decades. They're very successful. That's how they want it. That's what they mean by socialism. If you're not aware of that, okay. But to not understand that for them, talking about how the government could do more, they would laugh at you. That's got nothing to do. For us, everything is about changing the daily life we live in our workplace, where we go 5 days a week, the best hours of the day. That's socialism, really, not a question of what a distant government does or doesn't do. In other words, there's a long history and a literature and experience of these different meanings of socialism. Americans live in a desert where those don't exist, and that allows people to say silly things as if they were real.
So, for instance, Larry Kudlow could read your book, Understanding Capitalism. Is this why you wrote this book, Understanding Capitalism? Because it really is a wonderful primer in very simple terms of how to understand some of these political distinctions, some of these socioeconomic distinctions?
Well, I'm flattered that you ask. And the answer is a very enthusiastic yes. That's why I wrote it. The first 2 chapters in the book are about what is capitalism and what capitalism is not. In other words, you get clear in your head what people have said it is and what people have said it isn't, because it's been around for 3 or 4 centuries. It's just naive to imagine everybody agrees on what it is. They don't. They never did. You have to be taught that, and you should be taught that in relationship to the other systems that are around in the world, and among which we ought to be free to choose. You know, Americans like to tell themselves this story. We believe in freedom of choice. I always found this a very strange thing. What it seems to mean is when I go into a drugstore, I want 27 kinds of toothpaste. One that's blue, one that's got yellow stripes, one that's got little bits of color in it. I want a choice. And yet when it comes to the newspaper in your town, 1 or 2 seems to be enough. When it comes to politics, 2 parties, Republican and Democrat, often hard to tell apart, seem to be enough. And now let's come to economic system. If you want freedom of choice, tell your people about what the different systems are and let them choose. That would be consistent with what you say you believe. We don't do that. We teach rah-rah capitalism. And yeah, I wrote the book to make it crystal clear in one place, accessibly written for everybody. Here is what the issue is. Here's what capitalism is thought to be by these people. Here's what they don't agree on. And then what are the problems with capitalism? What are the myths about capital? Take people through so at the end, you may still like capitalism. That's your business. But you'll understand it way better than you would have if you just were left in the world of media who do not cover the alternative explanations or the rich diversity that is both capitalism and the socialist alternative.
Well, it's very interesting to me that you see people who are workers thinking they are capitalist when they're in fact a worker. Like Lieutenant Dan, you ain't got no capital. But I want to shift the frame because this is the convention is coming up, and you talked about rah-rah capitalism, and I think we're going to hear a lot of that. The theme is going to be saving democracy. We're going to hear about a little bit. We're going to hear a lot about saving democracy, but I want to hear your thoughts because it seems is happening perpetually for decades now is that we have a neoliberal government, neoliberal political parties who have abandoned working people, and that they've created the conditions out of which strongmen fascists like Donald Trump, neo-fascists, can rise out of that swamp to do what those type of fake populist strongmen do. And then what happens is we're put in this impossible position where they say, well, now we have to save democracy. And okay, but then we rally to put another neoliberal in, and they do nothing, very little to actually address the real problems that working people are facing. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on this dynamic as we're moving into this convention?
Okay, let me back up a little bit. I really do take democracy seriously. My commitment to socialism is a commitment to the democracy I wish we had. When I listen to Kamala Harris or Mr. Walz or anybody else tell me that what they're doing is saving democracy, I scratch my head, and I'm really tempted to talk this way. What are you talking about? What democracy? When you understand the word democracy from its origins, way back to Athenian Greece, it's about a simple idea. Democracy exists if and when the people affected by a decision are enabled to participate in making it. The logic why we vote for the mayor of our town or wherever it is because the mayor has the authority to make a decision that impacts us, so we get to participate in deciding who that mayor will be. And ditto for the Congress, and ditto for the city council, right up to the president. That's the idea. We have power because your decisions affect us. Okay, when you go to work 5 days a week out of 7, and you cross that threshold into the office, the factory, or the store, are you then in a democratic place? And the answer is no. People tell you what to do. You don't elect the CEO. The CEO can fire you, take from you your job, take from you your self-esteem, take from you the sustenance for your family. Wow, does he have power over you? And your power over him? Zilch. You don't vote for him. You probably don't even know his name. You can't control him. He can control you. The only thing you can do is quit. And if you do, you'll have to go find a job with another employer who will treat you more or less in the same way. So the reality is, where we spend most of our adult time at work, 5 days of the week, 8 to 5, the best hours of the day, we're in a situation that is undemocratic. It's autocratic. The owner of the business or the board of directors, typically 15 people, more or less, they make all the decisions. This is not democracy. We're not preserving democracy. We don't have it. I'd like to get it. I think most Americans would. We have a few Americans who've done it. They call those things.
I don't remember anyone voting for Kamala Harris.
No, no one ever voted for Kamala Harris to be the president of the United States. Maybe now she will be voted that way. But, you know, it's an extraordinary thing to keep telling people we're preserving democracy. No, you're not. You're not allowing democracy into the workplace. Right. It's never been in the workplace in our country, with the exception of worker co-ops, which have existed in the rural areas among farmers and have existed in some urban areas among industrial workers. There have been workers who've gone in that direction, who've set up co-ops, and they've been quite successful. The 7th largest corporation in Spain is a famous thing called the Mondragon Corporation. That's a worker co-op. It's a family of 200 worker co-ops, all of whom are run democratically. So no one should say, oh, that can't be done. Mm-hmm. I hear Americans say, well, somebody has to be the boss. Wait a minute. We got rid of kings and queens in this world. They used to think they were the boss. Then we all decided we don't want kings and queens. In the American Revolution, we could have said, George Washington, you be our king, instead of George III in England. But we didn't. We carefully avoided no more kings. Not George Washington, not Thomas Jefferson, none of them. We don't want a boss politically. Well, let me ask you a question all socialists like to ask. If we don't want a boss politically, why are we wedded to a boss economically? It's a little bit like women in modern society have said, we don't want a boss as a husband. We want a husband, but we don't want a boss. We could like to have a husband without a boss. We'd like to have family. We'd like to have relationships, but we don't want one to be the boss of the other. That's all the working class should be saying to itself and to everybody else. We want to be full human beings, democratically able to shape our environment. We don't want a small group of people telling us what to do, especially when what they're in there for is to make more profit, and we're the people who live on the wages. They're going to make the business do what's good for them, profit, not what's good for us, wages. This is not a situation we ought to accept.
Right. But how do we then contend with this catch-22 situation where we really do have a global neo-fascist movement. It is a global movement. We're seeing it in France. We're seeing it in Brazil. We're seeing it all over the world. And of course, you know, the United States is also helping to promote that as well. So now we really do have a neo-fascist movement who is, again, potentially poised to take control of 1/3 of the government. How do we contend with that?
Well, I think we have to begin by understanding why all this is happening, why the surge in so-called strong men, why the fascism we thought we had put to rest historically with the end of Hitler and Mussolini and all of that has now come back, why the white supremacy we thought we had finally put behind us has now come back. I think we're not going to get a solution until we understand why this is happening. And here I have to explain, as an American economist, I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. I've lived and worked all my life in the United States. I understand that it's difficult for my fellow Americans to understand what I'm about to tell you, but it's the fact, and you better get used to it. The American empire is over. We've had 75 to 100 years in which the United States was the top king of the heap economically. We were the richest country. We were the most powerful. We were the one that was growing the most, all of that kind of thing. You know, the United States currency, the dollar, the dollar was the global currency, all of that. It's over. It's been over for 10 or 15 years. We are now on the downside of every empire. Every empire is born, zooms up, peaks, and then goes down. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the British Empire, which was where the United States started as a small corner of the British Empire. It's gone. The American Empire replaced it. Like every other empire, it had its day. A new empire is emerging. It'll either be the Chinese or it'll be a new way of organizing the world in which we don't have an empire. We have multipolarity, as the political scientists like to call it, of some kind of agreement among countries that we hoped to get in the League of Nations, but it didn't work out. And we hope to get in the United Nations, and it didn't work out. Maybe now it will. But the American empire is over. And that is the number one reality that we are living through.
So how is this going to affect working people? So, you know, we've seen an enormous concentration of wealth at the top 10th of 1%. Actually, I wanted to roll that back just a second, because we were talking about no more kings and queens. And when I was reading your book, you talked about the French Revolution ushering in the end of feudalism, but it got me to thinking, really, when you have 8 people controlling 40% of the world's wealth, what's the difference? You know, are these not kings and queens that shape the destinies of nations because they have so much wealth? In fact, they have more wealth than some of these previous monarchs ever did. So they wield control over an entire planet. How do you balance that? How do you reconcile that?
Let me connect them. When the economy goes down, it's going to be a problem for everyone. But in our society, which is hierarchically organized, which has rich and powerful people at the top, the 1%, the 5%, whatever you want to call them, they're in a position, because they have the money and they have the political power, to hold on to their wealth, to hold on to their social position while the economy and the empire go down. Another way to say this is they push the burdens of a declining empire off of themselves at the top onto the middle and the bottom. That's what we're living through. Look, I'll give you 2 examples and show you how it impacts the working class. We have one of the lowest minimum wages in the world, $7 federal, $7.25 an hour. It's outrageous. When was that set?
In the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, 2009, And with Republicans and Democrats alike, they could not find a way to raise the minimum wage just to keep pace with the inflation. Since 2009, prices have gone up every year, sometimes a lot, but the minimum wage, flat, $7.25. You know what that is? That's really whacking the people who are the poorest among us. I'll give you a second example. If you look from 2010 to right now, and you calculate the payout to the elderly, Social Security, tens of millions of Americans rely on the Social Security check for the quality of their last years. That hasn't kept pace with inflation either. It hasn't been raised equal to the rise. So the old people can't afford today what they could in 2010 or 15 or even 2020. So let me summarize. The poorest people and the elderly are being squeezed by the declining empire. Meanwhile, Elon Musk can't figure out what to do with his obscene billions. This is a system that is no longer working for us. It's working for them, but not for us. And the reason you have the strong man is that masses of Americans are correct. They feel left out. They feel denied. They want to go back to the way things were, which they idealize, as people often do. That's why they call it MAGA. They want to go back. They want to hold on to, like those people at the top. They're not crazy. They're not weird. They are reacting to wanting to hold on. And the regular Democrats and Republicans, by and large, ignored them.
Well, I think there's also a layer to this that's important, though, that when they hearken back, which is what fascism classically does, fascism classically harkens back to a mythical past. But really, I think that they're looking at the changing demographics. They're looking at the demographics getting more black, more brown, and so white supremacy for poor working people is like sort of one of the last advantages for poor working people. So I think we can't ignore that white supremacy is a really, really powerful element of that narrative. But I want to, there's a quote from your book. You said, capitalism trains you to accept the suffering of others. This unchecked individualism also trains people to accept and justify the horrific consequences of capitalism because those are blamed on its victims. And that just, makes me think of all these headlines where I see Gen Z needs to stop buying Starbucks so they can afford their student loans. And it's just so insane as, BlackRock and private equity keeps buying up all of the houses. Private equity keeps buying up all the houses and apartments, jacking up the rents. And then you have, corporations price gouging. And then somehow that becomes the fault of working people.
Well, I think what you're watching is, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that we live in a system that has had several centuries to refine its message. And what it has done is realize you can accept, you can recognize problems and faults, and it releases steam to let people talk about it. The rent is too high, or this. So long as when they talk about it, they carefully sanitize their own discussion so that never do they say the problem is capitalism. Anybody, look, it can be China, it can be black people, it can be you name it. As long as you don't attack the system, capitalism, the people who sit at the top of the system, you are free to talk about whatever problems you want. Blame it on the victim, blame it on somebody. Look, I mean, we have been cruel beyond words to the poorest people on earth, Central American immigrants leaving that part of the world, trying to come to the United States for the same reason that all the rest of us came to the United States over our history as a nation. All right, we're turning them away. We're putting their kids in cages. We're doing unspeakable. Why? Why? Well, we don't want to ask the question, why are these people leaving their countries? Because the economies of those countries have collapsed, because climate change makes their lives there impossible, for which the United States has its share of the blame. Oh, no. Oh, no. Something's wrong with them.
Right.
They are, well, what did Mr. Trump say? They are criminals, or they have diseases. Terrify people, but never the problem. And last point I want to make, you're saying white supremacy gives them something to hold on to. I get that. But why are we, the left, not able to say, you're a worker, you white person, you black person, you female, you trans, whatever. You have something in common, your workerness. That's what's being shafted here. Your commonality isn't your white skin. That Elon Musk has one of those. You're not him, and he's not you. We're not all white together, are we? Well, wait a minute. Maybe the left needs to give people the identity as a working class that could make them then come together and change the system. But to do that, they have to understand that the system is their problem.
Well, I think it's interesting because you point that out in your book, how most people think class is about the amount of wealth or power that you possess, when really it's about you belong to a group of workers or owners. And I think that that's an important distinction. But the Harris campaign, it's interesting because the right wing is always very good at lying and distilling these simple tropes. Like Biden did that. Biden isn't responsible for inflation. Biden is responsible for rising gas prices. Biden is responsible for the price of goods. And it's so interesting because they're so adept at just taking these scary concepts, like why people are suffering, and turning it into a trope. But the Harris campaign is expected to propose a ban on price gouging. Okay, good. But to your point, why not address price gouging in the fossil fuel or the pharmaceutical industries, especially as this is affecting people's spending power in an economy, but also, we're in the middle of a climate apocalypse. It's now. Like, we're in the middle of a climate apocalypse, and the Biden administration greenlighted 1,500 new fossil fuel projects.
Well, for me, I look at it this way. The Biden administration decided to do something about infrastructure. We have, deteriorating roads and bridges and all of that. And everybody focuses, they're going to do something about roads and bridges. Well, I'm an economist. Let me explain to you. When you decide to rebuild bridges, what are you doing? You're going to give billions, I'm talking hundreds of billions of dollars, to large corporations that fix roads, that repair bridges, that do all of what we call infrastructure improvement, which means that the billions are not just going to have these things done, but they're going to particular institutions, corporations. And what do we know about those institutions? That the money they get, they give disproportionately to shareholders as dividends, to top managers as enormous salaries. And where do they try to economize? On their labor costs, you and me. In other words, what we're buying...
You're telling me that money does not trickle down. That's what you're saying.
Never did. They never did. Look, if you wanted to do good, you would fix the road, but not give it to a company that will make sure that the current unequal distribution of wealth and income is reproduced, because that's what they've done. They brought us to this point.
But Richard, have you not considered that these executives making like tens of millions of dollars, that they work thousands of times harder than workers? Have you not considered that maybe they just work thousands of times harder?
Well, here I have a personal advantage. Even though my parents had absolutely no money, and I had to go to college and university and get my PhD by getting scholarships, which I did all the way through. I did attend Harvard Stanford, and Yale. Those are the three schools that I got my degrees from. I'm like a poster boy. And most of my roommates and dorm mates come from the richest family whose parents were CEOs. And when I went to visit them, which I did like any other college kid does, I got to see how the CEOs of many of our biggest companies live. Now, they may want you to think that they're working their knuckles to the bone, but they're not. They're having lovely drinks, playing lots of tennis, going on hikes, and living a quite comfortable life. Thank you. The notion
So they're
that
not
they
working
are
thousands of times harder.
no, I mean
Get up and grind.
it's just I don't want to bring anybody down. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but no, they don't want to do that. Like most people, they do some work. They go to work in the morning. They do it. They stay there. They give extra hours when they have to, but they also want to have a family. They want to have a trip. They want to have a vacation, and they get all of that, only much more comfortable than most of the rest of us can afford. They go to the right resorts we can only see in magazines. It's the idea that these people are working. This is childish. The average cop works harder than they do. The average miner, the average farmer, the average you name it, works as hard or harder than these people do without the supports. A CEO gets driven to and from his job in the morning. He doesn't take the bus or the subway or the train. He doesn't. He has his own airplane that flies him on his schedule.
But I mean, listen, Elon Musk, all he had to start out with was an emerald mine. So, I mean, you got to admit that that's pretty good for what he's made of himself. When all he had to start out with was just a little emerald mine. So, I mean,
right.
I think
Donald Trump started out with a couple of $100 million worth of real estate that his father gave him. I understand, if you understand how wealth is handled in the United States, it's handled by being handed down from parent to son. By the way, that's what the kings used to do. We used to have a king or a queen, and why were they the king or the queen? Because they were the child of the previous king or the queen. That's what we have now. We have most of our millionaires are people who got their money by inheriting. They didn't do anything.
So this is, for me, this is where for me it gets tricky, because again, we're put into these impossible situations to support neoliberal establishments that we know without significant pressure are not going to, on their own, break from their wealthy donors in the Hamptons and pass policies. And they're not going to do this. Bernie Sanders might have, because that represented his values. But we know that generally it's not going to happen. But now we do have, we're facing another potential neo-fascist takeover. And they, in the last administration, abolished the estate tax, which they rebranded the death tax, which is now ensuring a greater funneling of wealth, generational wealth. They're dropping the marginal tax rates to almost nothing, which is, again, and then under Donald Trump, something like $3.4 trillion funneled out of the poor and working class into the hands of the billionaire class and the 1%. So how do we reconcile this going into these elections? Because the threat of neo-fascism is real. There is a chance that Donald Trump could decide to stay in power, as other strong men have done. How do we reconcile this?
Well, I think the answer is buried in your question, and here's what I mean. We have watched, as spectators, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We've had 4 years of Trump, then we had 4 years of Biden. Now we will get who knows, and we had Clinton and we had Bush. We have this very cozy arrangement between the two major parties, both of which, in my opinion, are competing to manage the same capitalist system. Nancy Pelosi said it brilliantly when a student asked her a few years ago, well, what is your view on socialism? And she looked genuinely befuddled, like Mr. Kudlow. Why? Well, she ended up coming back and saying, we're all capitalists now. Exactly. Thank you, Nancy Pelosi. Best answer you could have given. It's correct. And we're not going to be out of the trouble we're in so long as we accept that. There ought to be an opposition party. And by opposition, I mean a party that says, no, we are not in favor of supporting, managing, improving capitalism. We're not that. We are in favor of a better, different system. We're the party that says you can do better than capitalism. And we celebrate that there were enough people under slavery who said we can do better than slavery, so we don't have that anymore. And there were enough under feudalism who said we can do better than feudalism, and so we don't have that anymore. And now we're at the end of a capitalist period where the working class is saying, hey, we can do better than capitalism, but you have to organize and do it. You asked me earlier, and I answered. In France, people used to say, we have only got their equivalent of conservative and liberal. That's all we'll ever have. That's what we got. Do the best you can. Well, they didn't listen. They formed their own left-wing parties. By the way, they have choice. They have lots of parties, not just two. But four of them got together, and they're now the dominant party in the parliament. So is it possible to take a position against capitalism and win millions of votes? Of course it is. So it has happened repeatedly.
To the point in your book, you talk about capitalism and individualism. And I would argue that it is actually the cultural conditioning of consumerism that runs, it's in the DNA, it's in the drinking water. And I see this, it influences our identity as voters. We look at our candidates as this is my favorite brand of kombucha, as opposed to looking at, as Occupy organizers did, pushing Bernie Sanders to run, being the energy and the movement behind those efforts. We see the identity as that of a consumer, and that runs within our independent parties as well. Instead of when all of labor, independent parties could get together and create a coalition like they did in France and build real power. But I think it's, as you point out in your book, it's the consumerism that really, is a paradigmatic factor.
Jay, I wish I could stay with you, but I have another TV interview I am committed to.
Okay, great. Let's wrap up. How much do we have to wrap right now, this moment?
Yeah, I realize I'm already 7 minutes late.
Let's wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard Wolff, for joining us. Thank you. Please, everyone, get his book, Understanding Capitalism. He also has a wonderful podcast on YouTube, Democracy at Work. But Richard, I just want to thank you for your decades of work and helping to elucidate some of the difficult concepts. Thank you for joining us and speaking on behalf of working people. So, and how can people continue to follow you?
Easiest thing is to go to the website, democracyatwork.info. Real simple.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard Wolff, for joining us. And stay tuned for the People's Mic. We have lots more in store. Everyone, this has been the People's Mic.